Supposed to repeat questions for the video. So the question is, how do we, or how does COMPAS take into account sort of socioeconomic status, folks coming from a privileged background versus an underprivileged background, and whether it be disproportionate minority issues or whatever it is, how is that reflected, or how do we take that into account? And that's a really difficult question. It's probably the one that I wrestle with the most with an implementation of a risk need assessment tool, okay? I don't have a great answer for it. The body of literature and research is very divided, and it's conflicted about this. So what I can say is COMPAS doesn't specifically ask questions about privilege, doesn't ask anything about race. It's race blind. However, the things you're talking about, and I'll just say it, I mean, it's more prevalent in Milwaukee and Madison, the institutional racism that we have and the disproportionate minority issues that we have are reflected in arrest rates, are reflected in a lot of the interaction and exposure to a criminal justice or child protection or whatever it is system, right? They just are. And so a tool that looks at some of those things, we are counting number of arrests. We are looking at residential stability. We're not really looking at neighborhoods, but we are looking at safety in their residence, in their community setting, in their family circle. Those things can be perpetuated by a risk tool. And that's the best I can answer that question. I think that's something we need to take into account. And I think the, sort of a cop-out, I guess, but I think the body of work in this area needs to continue to evolve to give us better options and better ways to either mitigate or control for some of that. We haven't done hard, solid research studies on this. I have because I'd say I do, this question is what keeps me up at night. And I have looked at data from the race perspective. I've run race distributions, low percentage in low, medium, and high by race. We're not seeing, luckily, as a state, now if I broke it out in local jurisdictions, maybe, but we're not seeing a disparity between, say, blacks being higher risk, more in the high risk category versus whites based on maybe racial profiling or arrests or whatever. But that is something that we have to keep an eye on, and it's a very important discussion. So, all right, we'll keep us moving. So again, the point here is, and I think I was mentioning this, when I get this question, first thing I do is I look at those because those will tip you off and those will help you understand. Current age, number of prior arrests. So this kind of illustrates that a little bit. I like this slide. We'll just really quickly look at it. This is a sort of a representation of our norm group that we're currently using. And you'll see how the concepts we're talking about are borne out. So really quickly, you've got your low, medium, high, and high risk groups. Mean age at first arrest for your low risk folks, for those assessed in COMPAS, it's about 25 years old. High risk group, mean age at first arrest is just under 15. And so on it goes. You can see, percentage of that category that have had a prior assault. So the percentage of low risk folks assessed in COMPAS, or at least in the norm group anyway, 6% have had a prior assault, 75% in the high risk category. Weapons offenses are crazy to me. 15%, 16% in the low risk category, 75, again, 3/4 of the high risk folks have a weapons offense in that norm group. So you can start to see some of those statistics borne out. Go ahead.
So you're saying in the low group that the average number of prior arrests is almost 6?
Yeah.
What that means? So are these compasses that are being done by DOC?
Yes. No, that's a great distinction, and we'll come to it when we get to the norming versus validation discussion. This is the COMPAS normative data that we're currently using. So this is a cohort of correctionally involved people that were assessed and that were used to norm the current version of COMPAS that we're using.
For Wisconsin or national?
Not Wisconsin, national. So we're just about ready to flip that switch to go to a Wisconsin norm group. These are folks made up of people from Virginia, Georgia, New York, Wyoming. I'm missing one other one. New Mexico, I think. So not representative of our Wisconsin population. That's why we're going through the norming process right now.
How are they different? How, just generally, because it seems like the lowest, you know, that's a really high number.
It is a high number, yeah.
So are these prison folks that they're seeing, or are they?
It's a combination. So the composite norm group is both prison, jail, and probation. And without having the norm, breakdowns, I don't know exactly what percentages. Yeah, just 5.93 strikes me as a little high for low risk. Go ahead.
You said that we're on the cusp of using Wisconsin as the
Yeah.
database. Has anybody done any analysis to see if there are any statistical significant variations between Wisconsin and the normative group?
Yes, yes. So the question is, I mentioned we're on the cusp of switching to a Wisconsin norm population, and through that process, was there any analysis done to determine if we look basically any different than that composite norm group? The answer is yes. If we'll hold that just a little bit longer, I have a slide on norming, we'll go through that. But I sat in a meeting on Tuesday with our research department where they broke down about 45 different graphs to our executive staff about exactly how might we look different and what does it mean for us to move our cut points, adjust our cut points a little bit to account for those differences in a Wisconsin population versus a national population. It's a really interesting discussion. Go ahead.
Are you going to break down the Wisconsin norming numbers based upon region? I.e. Milwaukee up here?
Yeah, it's on the to-do list. We have not done it yet. And not because we don't want to. It's just a resource issue. The research department, we got to, our norm group that we will use for Wisconsin is huge. We have over 200,000 assessments in COMPAS now. When our norm cohort that we carved out, we looked at assessments done, I think, in the last 2 years. We just junked all the first 2 years of assessments. We're saying we're still cutting our teeth, getting used to the software. But we're still, I think, close to 100,000 assessments. And what the larger your sample should start to control for any outliers or for any one jurisdiction. But the discussion is about, well, what percentage of our population is Milwaukee, and what percentage is rural and urban. And so we'll need to do that eventually. I think if I was trying to be Tony Strevler, our research director, he would say that our N is large enough that we're okay to look at the whole population of Wisconsin, and it's still going to get us closer than the national population. And then the next step is just it's constantly dialing in a little bit more and a little bit more. So we'll talk a little bit more about that norming question in a little bit. Let's see, how am I doing on time? All right. So multimodal assessment. I said we would talk a little bit about how the assessment is actually administered. There are three main pieces of the COMPAS assessment. And when we talk about the assessment, I'm talking about the core assessment. There are several versions of COMPAS. There's a reentry assessment that's done at the back end of a prison stay. There's a COMPAS youth. There's what we call a COMPAS primary needs, which is more of a screener. That's done first. It's a shorter version of the assessment. But we're talking about COMPAS core here, because that's the one that's most traditionally used. It's the one you're using in Eau Claire. And there's three main sections to the COMPAS, to the assessment. And this is what we call multimodal assessment. And so we're taking information from various sources. But the first section is what we call the official records section. It's about 30 questions. And it's primarily driven by criminal history and static information that's collected in advance. And so these are your age of first offense question, your prior arrests, felony arrests, misdemeanor arrests, juvenile, adult, violent, nonviolent, all of those things. One of the questions I received was, what systems do we use to garner this information? I like that question because every chance I get, I say we hold ourselves to a high standard and rely only on the Portal 100 as, I shouldn't say only, we'll use other tools, but the Portal 100 or the NCIC-CIB criminal record from Department of Justice is our source of truth for that. So we really strive to make sure everybody doing assessments is using that Portal 100 out of the time system. And the reason for that is we're sharing this information, across jurisdictions, and we don't want anything to kind of erode that relationship. So we don't want, an assessment to be done here in Eau Claire, and if that person unfortunately gets committed to DOC later on, we're using that assessment. We don't want someone to say, well, Eau Claire doesn't really, they just rely on prior, or they on self-report for prior record, and we don't like that, so we're going to redo the assessment. We want everybody on the same sheet of music. So we collect those first 30 questions from the collateral information. We'll also use, for institutional history stuff, we'll use our WIC system, or which is an internal DOC system, or CCAP, or other things like that. But the source of truth should be Portal 100. The second piece then is when we act, is the bulk of the assessment, when we bring the client in, and we're going to do the interview. And so we have the next, I don't know, maybe 60 or so questions about, that's the social history information, where we're interviewing that person, asking them about all these different domains in their life, everything from family to substance abuse and treatment, to job and school and peers and leisure, recreation, hobbies, and all of these different things. And we're doing that, administering that in sort of a guided interview. So when you're first learning how to administer the assessment, you're probably asking the questions right verbatim off the sheet. So, who is the figure that principally raised you? Mother, father, other, blah, blah, blah. As we get a little bit better with the assessment over time, we start to have the person tell us the story. So we want to develop the rapport and have it be more of an interactive discussion. Tell me about your early family life. How was that? And things like that. And so the idea here, if we do it right, is we're not hitting someone right first time we meet them right off the bat with all these questions. We're taking a little time. We're developing some rapport. And I'm really proud of DCC and the strides that they've taken in doing their assessment process. When you initially rolled it out, you had 30 days to meet with the person and do the assessment. You're cramming it all into one interview. Well, now they've expanded that to a potential 60 days. So we have more time to get to know the person before we're asking them to be honest with us about these things. In addition, if it's done right, we should be going back with them and at least reviewing that criminal history section as well, those first 30 questions, and saying, does this look to you like an accurate reflection of these questions? And making sure that we're, to the best degree possible, reaching consensus on those answers. And the third section then is what we call the self-report section. It's the last 30, 40 some questions. That's actually, we print that last section off. That's supposed to be slid across the table to the person, and they're supposed to answer those without any sort of influence or bias by us. Those are questions about a person's internal attitudes and beliefs. It gets at your internal stuff, right? So it's questions like, it's okay for a hungry person to steal, or it's about respect. It's about how they see the world around them, their victim stance, all those different things. And so we take those, we let them answer them on their own, and those are then bubbled into the system. Am I characterizing this like in the Eau Claire application? It's similar to what you guys do? Yeah, okay. So that's how the assessment is actually administered. We hope and we train that there's a motivational interviewing style when it's done. And so for a person who maybe, the gang one always comes up, well, are you in a gang? Have you ever been in a gang? No, I've never been in a gang. And you got a big gang, tattoo across your neck. Well, all right, tell me a little more about that. Help me make sense of this. I know who you're running with. The police report says you were doing this, but you're saying you're not, So you're kind of bouncing those two off each other, and you're exploring those discrepancies. That's the way you're really supposed to do that assessment. You have questions about that? I did have a demo. I'm not sure that we're going to get to it today. I want to make sure we answer all the questions. If we have some time at the end, I'm certainly willing to pull COMPAS up, and we can actually show you what those 130 questions look like. Where am I going? Question or just stretching?
Actually, no, I had a question.
Okay.
So sometimes we get COMPAS back that have the flag potential faking concern.
Yes.
Is that from the interview portion, the self-report portion, or a combination, or what is that from?
You couldn't have timed that question any better, because that's a slide. Thank you. Short answer, oh, sorry, I got to repeat the question. Question was, sometimes you see a bar chart come back, and it will say a potential faking concern has been flagged. Where does that come from? Does it come from the interview section, the self-report section, combination thereof? Well, how does that happen? So COMPAS has several what are called validation tests built into it. The one we're talking about is actually number 2 here, called the defensiveness scale, or the faking good social desirability scale. So there's 8 questions in the interview section. And I think there's some in the self-report. So maybe some of those 8 are in the self-report too, because I'm pretty sure there's both. At any rate, there are 8 questions that are put in there almost solely because any person who's being truthful or honest would answer in a certain way. So the example I always use is, I've never disliked anyone. Well, if we're really being honest, any of us pro-social people in this room probably can think of someone. That's an extreme question that we just, this kind of gets us the wrong way. So answering, yes, I've never disliked anyone, even that probably won't flag you on a defensiveness scale. But if you do answer in that way for a certain amount of those 8 questions, it's going to go ding, ding, this person might be trying to make themselves look a little better than they are. And so that's how that defensiveness scale works. Similar to that is the random responding test, or the coherence test. And that basically matches a bunch of different questions in the assessment. So sometimes we'll have assessors go, I already asked this question. Why are you making me ask them the same question again in a different way? Well, because they're paired, and we want to make sure that they answered the question one way over here, that they're answering it the same way over here. And it's the same thing again. So if enough of those paired questions are inconsistent with each other, it's going to flag something that's saying they're just kind of going A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, or not really paying attention and just giving you whatever willy-nilly answer. So that helps us a little bit. Now it's nice, you can't see it when you're just looking at the bar chart, but when you're actually in the software, if that flag comes up, you can click on it and it'll show you exactly which questions are inconsistent. And that's an awesome tool to be able to then do those motivational interviewing techniques. So just like, tell me a little more. This doesn't make sense because you said over here you're currently in a gang, but over here you say you've never been in a gang or something like that. So that's that coherence test. And then the third one is just a data conflict warning. It's similar to the first one. There's questions that just don't match up. So if your age at first arrest is marked as 17, but or 19, say, but then you say you have 3 juvenile adjudications, well, something's not right there. You're going to get a little flag that says you got to go back and look at those questions. So does that answer your question?
Yes, I guess a quick follow-up would be, so when we get someone who was flagged on the defensiveness scale or the data conflict, do we just discount the results, or what do we do?
Yeah, great question. So what do you do with that? I can answer what we would do internally when we see that. We should be going back and having a discussion with that client, either changing the answers if they decide to change, or making an assessment note and saying, assessment completed today. However, based on this pattern of answers and this flag, we have a concern that the client was not answering truthfully. Those things should be in a PSI report. That's like exactly the things we should be talking about in that attitudes and beliefs section, in the PSI report and the agent's assessments and impressions. It doesn't necessarily discount the whole assessment. We ask 130 questions for a reason. And remember, it's likely not affecting too much the risk score. It might, and it might be a reason for an override if they're really just blowing smoke the whole way. You may want to override to higher or whatever. But it's where that discretion comes in, and it's just another piece of information to say, I'm not completely confident that you engaged completely openly and honestly during the assessment process, and therefore, we're gonna take some other things into account. But I guess, and this is just my personal opinion, and I was an agent and a field supervisor. I worked in an institution. If done right, and if there is a rapport established, and if you're working with a person towards their end goals, and I know there's an obvious conflictual relationship there, but if you develop that rapport, 9 times out of 10, and I'm hoping practitioners in the room will agree with me, they're going to be honest. In fact, they spew everything. I mean, they will. If you know, one of the things I hear the most when I go out, so I try to go out, I don't go out enough now, and talk to our clientele. I was at MSDF a few weeks ago, Milwaukee Secure Detention Facility, and I was asking them, how does the process feel to you? What is it like? And over again, I hear, this is the first time someone actually sat down with me and took the time to ask questions and to get to know me. You've never gotten to know me before, and you make judgments about me, and you make recommendations to the court about me. And so I think when we demonstrate on our side, on the agency side, that we want to take the time to make better decisions and get to know more, I think that clients generally open up. But of course, people, our offender population will at times not be truthful too. Okay, keep us moving because I'm talking too much. How do we get at our recommendation for supervision? And how do we get, when we reference a medium or a high risk rate of recidivism, whether you see it in a PSI report or in probation files or whatever else, we crunch, and North Point or COMPAS helps us crunch the 2 scales, the risk of general violence and the risk of risk of general recidivism or risk of violent recidivism on this matrix, okay? And it plots them, it's a simple grid. It plots recidivism risk on this side and violent risk on this side. And we get what's called a matrix score or a risk level recommendation. This is also how we determine our supervision levels in the field. So someone who scores a 3 on violence and a 2 on general, they're coming up as a low risk, okay? Medium, you can see, and it just follows suit. The ones that are, remember that, that medium high category on that graph that had all the numbers? Medium high comes from these 2 sort of no man land areas here. So there, it doesn't happen super often, but they're, say, only a 2 on violence, but they're off the charts 10 on general recidivism on these decile scores. So what COMPAS then says is this is medium with override consideration, or medium high, that they're not likely to commit a violent offense, but something about their risk profile is spiking off the charts for general recidivism. So you want to think about possibly even moving that person up to a higher risk category. At least that's the way that supervision recommendation grid works. This is not like this is not a DOC thing. This is automated in the software, so it automatically spits out that ranking once those 2 risk scores are achieved. All right, so I am doing very poorly at time management. And I wanted to spend a little more time on this, but we may not be able to. The COMPAS needs scales. I really like talking about this area, and I'm not going to be able to say too much. But I referenced earlier the meanings and treatment implications document. And so when we see particular scores that don't make sense, look at that document and it'll tell you where that score is coming from. And the great example and a question that was submitted is, why do I see guys, females, probably much less females, come up as medium or high on violent risk, but they have no assaultive or violent history, okay? That happens, right? Now, a couple things. I put a document in your packet that's called, oh, what's it called? Someone say, violence scores, right. So North Point has done a small white paper on this to talk about the research behind this. If you look at that violence scale in your meanings and treatment implications document, you will see what's feeding the violent risk score. I am not a researcher. I'm reciting what the research says. And this research is not just North Point research. There's meta-analysis that will say that future violent behavior is predicted by more than just past violent behavior. Yes, violent behavior was part of it, but what is that violence scale looking at, if anybody's looking at it? I think there's vocational educational failure, non-compliance, current age, age at first again. So it is conceivable, it doesn't happen that often, and some may disagree, but it's conceivable that someone will have a medium or even high violent risk potential, but have no violent history. But that probably means if you go look in the scores that they've had a lot of failure in the vocational education. They're probably young. They're probably age of first arrest was young. And so they're still, those other scores are still putting them in that category, okay? And so that, and that paper that I gave you, it's a pretty easy read. It's a little statistical, but I can understand it, so you probably can. Talks a little bit more about why that happens and base rates and things like that. So females are a really good example. We're looking at females for the norming report. And we pulled numbers of every female offender that, and this is coming to DOC, referred to DOC, in the last 20 years, 86% of females do not have a single violent offense in their history, those using NCIC codes. And so if that's what your norm group looks like, if your norm group, once we switch of females, 86% are not violent. When you have one violent offense as a female, what do you think that's going to do to your risk score if you're comparing yourself to a large group of women who the vast majority are not violent? Right through the roof on violence. So it's also a discussion of the norming group and the cut points where they cut things so as to not overrepresent risk for someone who just has one violent offense. It's really interesting. Yeah?
When you look at the women, because many of our women will come on low risk,
Yep.
but they have incredibly high needs. Will the
Yes.
norming group, do you look at
Yes.
that so that you see more women in a medium risk?
Yeah.
after that?
Yeah. So I've unsuccessfully fended off this discussion long enough, and I'm going to go to it because it's multiple questions about norming. Question is, when we talk about females and when we look at norming, what does our norming for Wisconsin do to our percentage of females who score out as low risk but may be needy off the charts and may be overrepresented in the low risk category? Okay. So the answer is yes. We will be adjusting our cut points, likely a little bit. This is still not finalized. We'll have a communication that's coming out. But we're, the literature would say that you want, and I don't quite know, maybe you know, where this comes from, but you want roughly a 40-30-30 distribution of offenses in low, medium, and high. So 40% in your lowest category, 30% medium, 30% high. That's like a policy-driven, generally acceptable grouping for risk levels. I'm sure it's probably somewhat informed by resources and other things like that. It's not a DOC thing, that's a national thing when you do the research. Our research team has looked all over. Right now, I would say on the female side, we're, depending on what cuts and what groupings you're looking at, we're probably getting closer to 50% in the low risk category. And so that's when we compare to our national norms. So then what we're going to do is we're going to ratchet back our cut points a little bit to shift a small percentage of probably females, and this will happen for males too. It's all a progression, a process of dialing in, so we're getting better at getting those percentages. Shift a small percentage out of our low risk category and up into our medium and high. So we'll change our cut point. Maybe our cut point on the decile score, it's a statistical number behind the scenes, but say it's 3 and after, actually right now, say it's 4, and anybody under 4 is low risk, maybe it goes down to 3, and so those 4s who were once low risk go into medium risk. What's really interesting about that and where it becomes a complete policy discussion is we understand, and that's where our executives talk about, is that then casts a wider net in terms of identifying those for the medium and high risk population who you're going to provide services for. So it's a science-informed discussion, but then also it's a practical application policy discussion.
So then I have 2 questions.
Okay.
Are you going to have a separate COMPAS scale for women because men have such a huge, vast number of men, of people coming into the system are
Yep.
men? And secondly, will that mean then more services for these women? Because I'm coming across women on supervision who are low risk,
Yep.
but you know that there may be
Yep.
one drinking binge away from a
Mhm.
coma or from some other terrible
Right. So there are two questions. The second one is fresher in my mind. If we cast that wider net for females, perhaps there are even more in a medium risk population. Does that mean more services? Yeah, the frank answer is no. Resources are resources. They're finite resources. They're limited resources. So that's exactly what people, higher pay grade than me are wrestling with in the department and decision makers about when we change. It's a capacity versus need discussion. So we have a capacity to serve X number out of 1,000 offenders, regardless of how many you have, low, medium, and high. But what does our need look like? Right now we're demonstrating a need as this percentage of our population, females, males, whatever, low risk, medium risk, high risk. So as you change your need, as you change your people that you identify as having a need for this, and of course we're just talking risk right now, we're not talking criminogenic need, who need substance abuse treatment, who need cognitive behavioral treatment. It has an implication. Your gap then widens between your need and your capacity to serve that population. So the short answer is, we won't necessarily, we will do the best we can to make sure that we provide services to as many people who have the demonstrated need, but we won't magically have more services available. But the first part of your question, help me with it again.
Well, you have
separate groups. Scale. Right. So this gets me to one of the questions that was submitted. First of all, I'll clarify that when we do, when we assess, we have males are compared to males and females are compared to females. So we'll have separate cuts for both based on gender. Okay. So we're not comparing females to a group of males and females or males to a group of males. It's a gender. It's called a gender specific cut point. There are, and we don't have time to get into today, there are a few scales that they actually don't do that on, actually just one, but that's for a different time. But the broader answer is about gender responsive assessment. And so this is something I wanted to hit on because I know Tiana's been anxiously looking at this. So COMPAS does have, I'm being conscious of time, COMPAS does have a gender-specific or a female-specific assessment offered. Okay, it's called, well, the WRNA, which is Women's Risk Need Assessments, developed by the University of Cincinnati, Dr. Pat Van Voorhees. Basically what she did is she partnered with North Point, developed some additional scales that take into account female-specific criminogenic needs, if you will, female pathways into crime, okay? And the nuts and bolts of it is it adds, I don't know, I can't even remember, 70, 80 more questions to the assessment. And it changes, or it brings more criminogenic need information to the assessment. Now the key here, right or wrong, both sides of the camp on this, is those dynamic needs don't feed the risk score. So the risk algorithm, the risk model that COMPAS uses is going to be the same. It's not going to change the risk scores when we implement the gender responsive assessment. It will provide a lot more information to the criminogenic need areas. So we're talking about trauma, parenting, safety, and residence, and a lot of those things. And so what we would call those items, I'll be careful, are responsivity factors. So the research is still saying that they may not be completely criminogenic. Parenting skills are, dare I say, even trauma may not be completely criminogenic, but it's how you cope, problem solve, react to those very important factors in your life that will determine whether or not you get into criminal behavior. And so it's the criminal attitudes and beliefs. Remember, the top 4 on that card are still the most criminogenic factors, even though these other responsivity factors, mental health, parenting, trauma, and all these other pieces. And I'm not an expert on gender-specific assessment or treatment by any means, but that's the little amount that I know. So where we're going with that, the assessment is still, they're in between versions right now. So Dr. Van Voorhees at UCCI has finished version 2 of the WRNA. It's on paper, so the process is you get it over to North Point. They have to automate it and build it into the system. We're looking at probably having it ready to use Software-wise, by just around the end of this year, probably November, December, then we have to train and get folks up and running. I know Eau Claire has been interested in that, and actually many of your staff have already attended the training, so we'll be able to start using that. So then you'll probably see for females, not sure exactly what the application of it will look like, but for at least for some females, instead of seeing the normal core, you'll see the gender responsive core. And in fact, the meanings and treatment implications document, in the index, you'll see a bunch of scales that say WC in front of them. Those are all the women's core scales. I actually didn't make copies of the actual scale information. I probably should have in hindsight, but it linked in the document, and I was trying to save some trees, given that we haven't turned it on yet. So, but that's what the gender response, so there will be a separate gender responsive assessment available should Eau Claire want to use it. And it'll be a little bit longer for the DOC to start implementing it outside of the county because it's quite an expensive and lengthy training. Yes?
Really quick on what we're doing here. I don't understand, if we have like 50% of our women scoring low risk, why do we have to go into those 40, 30, 30? I mean, maybe 50% of our women are low risk, and so why are we wasting resources to get to those national tests?
Well, 50% based on a composite norm sample that is supposed to be predicting at 40, 30, 30. So when we compare, and I wish I had our researchers here to talk more about this because they're more schooled on it than I am. But when we compare our population to Wisconsinites to the national norm group, it's intended to cut them in roughly those chunks, but it's not. And so we have to, so it may be, I may have said it wrong. It may be that still just about, well, no, it should still be about 40, 30, 30 should fall into it, but it's not right now based on the composite. So we have to see how it does when we model it off of our population, and that's what our research staff does. So I'm probably not answering your question the best. It's a very researchy question. But, it's a policy discussion about making sure that we're getting, I guess, a research-driven slice of each of the population in, so we generally know that we're in the right area. Yeah, go ahead.
I think you're trying to say standard deviations.
It could be.
Not distributed correctly.
Oh.
So that's probably why
Yeah.
We need to change that.
There you go. Thank you. All right. So to make sure I get back to the question, though, about how did our Wisconsin population look compared to the national norm sample, kind of already talked about it. We're very, very close. Okay, we're literally, percentage points away when we look at our, racial distributions, ethnic, gender, male, female, all of that. But we are just a little bit different in some areas. We don't quite know. You have to drill down. So we make speculations about. Maybe it's our, our OWI population. Maybe it's the fact that we have a tendency to want to drink more in Wisconsin than other states. I don't know what it is. You can argue that if you want. I don't know. All I know is when I come into the airport in Madison, it says there's T-shirts that say "Drink Wisconsinably." It's like that's not a culture thing. I don't know what is. It's kind of sickening, actually. But, for discussion on validity, so we're going to be making that switch. You'll see a communication. We'll have an agency-wide communication that comes out when we talk about, yes, we're making the switch. We're comparing to Wisconsinites now. We think we're a little bit better dialed in. But that norming process alone still doesn't tell us, and maybe this gets at your question too, Dana, doesn't tell us if the assessment is doing what it's intending to do, which is predict the likelihood of recidivism with our actual percentage points. I mean, theoretically, I don't know them, but there's percentage points behind each one of those decile cuts. And that's, of course, when we have to do a validation study. So that basically entails then taking that norm group, that composite, or that Wisconsin norm group, and following them for 1, 2, 3, 5 years out, and measuring how well COMPAS is predicting a low risk, a medium risk, a 4 versus a 7, and actually measuring their recidivism rate with the follow-up period. So our research department has started that. We do have the capacity to do pretty sophisticated recidivism reports, and we're using those recidivism models with a regression analysis. I think that's what it's called. to follow our COMPAS norm group. And so we'll be able to we're probably pretty close to being able to do a 1-year follow-up now, but you don't really want to put too much stock in that because you want to follow folks for 3 years. And so we will be validating externally outside of the North Point validation studies. So I said there's at least 1, maybe 2 studies listed in the back of the PowerPoint. North Point, I think I have North Point's website on there too. They do have a ton of research on there, white papers, validation studies for their scales. I look at those, I think they're good, I think they're nice, I think they're sound, but I also think they're done by the authors of the tool. So I want to see research and validation done by people that don't have a stake in their own proprietary for-profit assessment tool. There's a good validation study done by New York, one by Michigan. I think I have at least 1 listed there. If you're interested in more, those are there. And again, in the future, ideally, hopefully, we will have the same validation report for Wisconsin. And we can talk about our own internal to us validation. We're just norming at a couple different decision points. So depending on the assessment and the decision point, there may be slightly different cut points. We'll talk about that. We won't have time to do a demo today. Certainly willing to do that after. If anybody has any specific questions about what COMPAS looks like, we can get to that. Just a couple last slides. This is now intended to, if you're not already asleep, to completely put you to sleep or give you a headache. You have a bigger copy in your binder if you were lucky enough to get one, your folder. This is simply to illustrate, we're not going to go through it. This is simply to illustrate a system mapping exercise. I'm preaching to the choir. Eau Claire is very much progressive in terms of doing this for your system. But anytime you apply or implement a risk needs assessment tool that is supposed to inform multiple decision points, you really need to go through this process. This is what we call the Wisconsin offender life cycle. And so if you start all the way at the top at the arrest, there's a charging decision, they go through the courts, maybe they come to DOC and this giant correctional pinball machine is, DCC, DAI, and DJC, juvenile and adult institutions, and people move all through that. And so those boxes are intended to illustrate the different decision points that we need to inform our decisions about what we're going to do with that person using the COMPAS assessment. And so it helps to map that system out. And when I go to different TAB meetings and I see counties, smaller counties, like going, how the heck am I ever going to implement a risk needs assessment tool? For number one, I don't have the staff, I don't have the money, I don't know what to do with the results. You just got to back up and you got to start with a system mapping exercise that helps you just lay it all out. And so I share this just in that there was a lot of thought and a lot of time in trying to map this whole thing out for us and figure out how it's going to inform our practice. And we have a long ways to go with that as well. This is a chart. Again, Sean could talk here, but the sort of the secondary or tertiary benefit of using an automated system is you got a big, giant correctional data pantry, right? And so we can learn about what we're doing. This was La Crosse County OWI court a while ago. Said, I want to see what it looks like. This is actually quite 2012, so it's a little old now. What does our OWI treatment court population look like across criminogenic need? Are we putting people with substance abuse in our program? And so we ran the data for them. And the good news is it was definitely borne out. 100% of the people in your program had a substance abuse need as identified in COMPAS. What this graph doesn't talk about is this was before they were using the risk principle and using the risk score to at least inform decisions about who's going to go into a treatment court. So theoretically, this represents people who are low risk, maybe medium risk, maybe high risk, we don't know. But could there have been damage done by putting low risk people in with medium and high risk and providing a lot of services? So just an example, I guess, of the kind of data that you can get out of COMPAS. And I know for Eau Claire, Sean's able to get a lot of information and inform a lot of different practice locally here. Jeff.
What would be your opinion about something like that, knowing the live course, where a lot of these guys are low risk?
Yeah.
They're looking at people they're in.
Yep.
And they're looking at someone who may have a 10 or whatever.
Yep. Yeah, my opinion, and I will say this may not be a DOC endorsed opinion, is that we have to be talking about overrides for some of those. We have to, at a certain point, a policy decision where we're looking at someone who's a 5th, 6th, 7th OWI, and if they're still coming out at low risk, we either need to have the resources or need to be able to somehow get an OWI-specific risk assessment to help us see a different variation of risk, or we need to look at possibly putting that person in OWI court anyway. But it's a case-by-case basis, and it's discretionary because you don't want to overdose if they truly are low risk. But I don't know a lot about the OWI court. I don't know if they're only looking at 5s and 6s or if they're taking anybody 2s and 3s. Ideally, again, you'd be using your OWI-specific assessment along with COMPAS.
I think that is typically what is happening. You know, the court would look at that as a schedule number 6.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and the guys in there, then how is that addressed, or what, how can we address the need of this person should go to a residential treatment facility?
Yeah.
And then someone in my position says he's low risk, we're not putting him in.
Yeah, putting him in. Yeah, that's the exact question that came up last time. I don't have a good answer. I think it's case-by-case basis. I think we need to look broader than just the assessment. I think policies are in place for the greater good, and they're sound when you look at large numbers of data. And I think you're defensible and fine with saying no low risk at all, go into a residential treatment program. But I think when you make it real with individuals and you look at all of the other factors outside of, especially an OWI case, which we know COMPAS isn't looking at all of the factors for OWIs, I do think you need to document well the other reasons why a person may need a service. But it's a very slippery slope. That's a very slippery slope because we don't want to just override and all of a sudden we have 50% of our low risk people there, because now the research is showing the opposite, that we could be doing harm. And in fact, I did include one of my favorite studies. It is a long read, but if you get to the link, it's on the back page. There's a sort of circuitous way you can get to an executive summary of it. It's that Ohio halfway house study. It is like the best #1 study that demonstrates a waste of dollars and actually making low-risk people worse by putting them in residential placement. It's a really interesting study. Go ahead.
I just want to comment that I don't think low risk for an OWI 6 person is very well reflected, simply because all these guys would have been spending considerable amounts of time in jail
Yep.
prior to that. So any concern about them mixing with some higher risk population
That's a good point.
is really,
Sure.
muddled, because
They're a part of that correctional population.
and they're still low risk.
Yeah,
So I think
and there's more than just mixing too. I think you have to look at other protective factors that you may remove from that person. Maybe there is a strong family support that you may remove by taking them out of their community or taking them out of their home. Maybe there's a loss of a job. So I think I always go to the first, the mixing lower and high risk, but I think there's another piece about they may be coming at low risk because there are other protective factors that are helping, and when you remove those protective factors, that's also to the detriment of the client too.
I just want to make sure everybody remembers that residential is not the only level of AODA services.
Very good. Yeah.
In fact, the state regs would say for licensed programs, every person is to have the least restrictive level of services first. So individuals don't have to be taken from their family. They can go to intensive outpatient services, which is probably much more appropriate when you talk about a second or third offense. By the time you get to 6th, you've totally lost the opportunity to have any effective intervention on that person.
Yeah.
6 OWIs?
Yeah.
Yeah, but you might have 6 OWIs, but you might not have had one for 15 years.
True.
And you may have had a 15-year period of sobriety.
Absolutely.
So
Hence,
you can't lump them all together. Right.
Great discussion. And the point I think I'm still doing, just about done. I'm still doing poorly on getting it on the video. The point was made that, several points. One, that an OWI 6, maybe it's a moot point when you're talking about low risk. By that point, there's been sufficient exposure to the criminal justice system, and whatever damage could be done may have already been done by an intermixing earlier on. Hopefully I characterized that right. Also, we need to be looking at a least restrictive alternative, And residential treatment isn't the only option out there, whether it be for OWI or AODA treatment. I think I'm just about finishing up. A few random FAQs that have come through that I just wanted to hit on. I talked about the gender-specific core assessment, so we covered that. Someone had asked, do we obtain releases to review treatment reports, diagnostic information? We do. Jeff can speak to that. The 1163 form is one of the first forms that we have the client fill out so we can get at that information, try to pull that information into our decision making, how are strengths determined. I wish we had more time to talk about that. Should have built that more into the PowerPoint, I think. You will see those strengths once in a while that make you scratch your head on the COMPAS report because some strengths are just completely auto-loaded or pre-populated from the assessment. So if a person is doing well in their job or has got their high school diploma or college degree, COMPAS will automatically say high school diploma or current skill or trade or something like that. The funny one we always see is it'll say age 30 or greater. That's a strength. It comes through. If you're over 30, it's going to be on your COMPAS report. And it's just mainly that that's that aging out thing. So it's I don't know, I don't really like it. It seems kind of hokey, but it's a software thing. But more importantly, strengths are determined by the assessor, by the administrator, by the caseworker in the case management process. And I want to remind everybody, one thing we didn't get to today was breaking down that bar chart, the criminogenic needs. But the first step of basic interpretation is looking at the bar chart and identifying the short bars. I know we're going to get to the big bars. That's why we're here. We're addressing the criminogenic needs. But looking at the strengths, any of those short bars, anything that says unlikely is actually a strength. So the discussion should be about what's working in this area. Where have you experienced success around this concept or need area, and how can we leverage that in other areas of your life? So we need to make sure, and those should be documented in COMPAS in that strength section. 2-day training for COMPAS, we offer that down in Madison. No one gets into COMPAS and does assessments without a 2-day training. And then they get a username and password to get in. And yes, a COMPAS can be completed on a 17-year-old. You're at the cutoff point there where you could do a COMPAS youth assessment or a COMPAS core assessment. There's enough representation in the norm samples for both. It's a bit of a discretionary exercise about what assessment you're going to apply there, but it is valid for 17-year-olds. And I did not leave a lot of time for questions, but I know we hit on a lot as we went through. Yes, Judge. Yeah. Very nice.
Is there a requirement of entering into an MOU if they want to use those pre-adjudication? When they came back trained and
Yep.
they were ready to go, and I said, well, wait a minute.
I think I may have connected with your folks yesterday. Have them call me if they have any questions like that. There is an MOU. Every county that comes on board, we ask that there's a boilerplate MOU that all counties sign. It's obviously there's no money attached, so it's not a big deal. But it just basically governs the relationship between DOC and the county in terms of access to the data, who owns it, blah, 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 blah. A bunch of legalese. Yep. I have taken up all our time. I want to be respectful of your day and your lunch hour. So I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming. That's what you were looking for.
Yes.